I'm very privileged and pleased to introduce you to Derrick Whybrew. Derrick was and still is a member of Homelands Free Church.
No. We moved to the parish church in 2004, and we've been there ever since. But I had previously been in membership at the Free Church since 1966 until 2004.
That's a good long period of membership.
Yeah. But bearing in mind there'll be some eagle ears and eyes that says, oh no, he's not.
In 1990, you wrote a book entitled Anchored to the Rock, Geared to the Times. It is the story of Homelands Free Church. Fortunately for us, you included a section entitled The Homelands Story. And Derrick has kindly agreed to talk to us today about the early beginnings of Homelands Church. Before we begin, could you tell us how you came to know Jesus and what brought you to Homelands Free Church?
Yes, well, I can remember the day that I gave my heart to Jesus very clearly. I was very blessed, being brought up in a Christian home, and I understood from a very early age that I was a sinner. And it was bothering me. I was 10 years old at the time, and I was worried what would happen to me if Jesus came back tonight. And we had a service in our church, the Evangelical Church in Whittam. On that particular night, it was a baptismal service. And at the end of the service, an invitation was given to anybody who might want to make a declaration of their faith. And I suddenly found myself walking down the aisle to the front of the church, indicating that that is precisely what I wanted to do. That was the 23rd of January 1944. So it has been my wonderful experience to be a Christian for over 80 years. And it has been quite remarkable how the Lord has led and guided in so many different ways. One of which was, how did we come to be in Frinton? Well, I worked in the city in one of the banks, and I used to travel up and down each day from Whittam to London. And I was very blessed in that I could therefore live at home and share a full life within the fellowship of the church. We had often said that Frinton was a very nice place. And in my teens, I fell in love with a lovely young lady who was part of the fellowship and ultimately married Jean. And we had nearly 66 years of truly happy married life together till she went to be with the Lord. And that experience and all the associated events with it have been a great blessing to me. Not one of which was suddenly, quite unexpectedly, to be told by the bank that they wanted me to stop working in London and go to Frinton-on-Sea, where, believe it or not, in the current situation, they were actually opening a branch. And they invited me to be one of the leaders of that branch in Frinton. Now, Jean and I, from the days that we started courting, laughingly said very often, Frinton would be a nice place to retire to. And that was it. So here I was being asked at the bank's expense to move to Frinton. But of course, I was then at that stage only 33 years of age, so I couldn't think about retirement. And anyway, we came to Frinton, and I can remember very well the day that we arrived. As we walked from the train to our new home in 4th Avenue in Frinton, I couldn't help feeling a certain amount of unease. This was something entirely different, a new home, a new church, a new environment. Anyway, it proved to be a very happy experience. On the very first Sunday that we were in Frinton, we went along to the Free Church, and we were delighted to find how friendly everybody was, although the average age of the church, looking around, was pretty high because they were mainly folk in retirement enjoying their time together. And at the end of the service, I noticed that our 3 children, we had 3 at that time, and we had Rosalind by adoption a few years later. Our 3 children were talking intently to the minister, who was down on one knee in the entry vestibule, and he seemed to be absolutely enthralled with the children, and they with him. And when we went home, the children were talking excitingly about that man who they talked to, and that was the Reverend Edgar Wright. He was a wonderful minister in the Lord to so many people. And it was obvious to us that if the children were going to be happy there in that church with the activities of the youth group and the Sunday school and so on, then that's where we would worship. Suddenly, I found myself within a matter of months being asked if I would stand to be a deacon. I'd only been in the church a matter of a few months. So we prayed about this, and I said that eventually, yes, that's okay. But then we had moved in the October 1966, and before the year was up in 1967, I was being asked if I would let my name go forward for election as the church secretary. Well, it was such a shock. I didn't know what was happening really, and I just had to say to myself and to the Lord, well, if it's your will, so be it. Now, I tell you this because I understand that at the subsequent deacons meeting with the minister said, because he told me this subsequently himself, the minister said, we have been praying for a long while that someone would come amongst us who could be church secretary, because the dear lady who was doing that, filling that role, was certainly getting now too old to do it. And he said to the deacons in that meeting, apparently, I believe we may have seen the arrival of our new church secretary. I wasn't even a deacon at that time. Anyway, the result was that at the election, I was elected to be church secretary, and suddenly found myself in a situation where it involved not only the church in Connaught Avenue, but they were involved in the possibility of expanding, because they were looking to build a church or a building on Homelands, which was due for rapid expansion. And to cut a long story short, we know that that's what happened. But the wonderful thing was that as I look back, I can see that against all the odds, that from the City of London via Frinton-on-Sea, the Lord was putting the pieces in place for Homelands development. Well, as a result of that, because there was only the church secretary and about 6 deacons at that time, we decided that we needed to do things perhaps a little differently. And Mr. Wright, the minister, thought that it would be wise to have elders and deacons. And as a result of that, we appointed a certain group to be elders, to assist the minister, deacons to look after the more practical things. The problem was that the church secretary seemed to have to be involved in all of it. And I found myself treading on strange ground. And it was not really expected, to me, certainly, that I would be involved in something like this. But that's what happened. And as I look back at that, I realise that God was just putting together the different pieces of the jigsaw, even at that early stage, and the involvement of what was necessary.
Absolutely.
And that's largely how I came
Yeah.
to know the Lord, became a member of the church, filled the role that I did for a number of years, and that was the way that I went into it.
Wonderful story. Thank you. So it was 60 years ago, on the 26th of January 1966, at a special church meeting of Frinton Free Church, that the story of Homelands Church began. This was part of the minutes of that meeting, which no doubt as church secretary you would have written. This special church meeting has heard with deep interest of the proposed development plans for our town. It was noted that by 1981 there will be a town of at least 10,000 people outside Frinton Gates. It has recognised the need of a free church to serve this community, and has felt the urgency of acquiring a site in the main shopping centre immediately. It therefore resolves, 1, that it accepts this challenge as a call from our Lord to go forward in faith. Can you remember anything of that meeting?
What's the date of that meeting?
26th of January
1966.
1966.
No, I cannot remember anything of that meeting because I didn't move to Frinton until August 1966. And so that initial decision to purchase the site and to move ahead was in fact just beginning in its formative state before I arrived.
Yep.
I very quickly discovered that it was entailing a vast amount of work and different learning things. And so I don't remember anything of that meeting. And of course, it wasn't until I was put onto the diaconate, which was in 1967, that I began to understand exactly what was happening. But the big shock was that in 1967, they wanted me to become church secretary from January 1968. I felt that this is one of the reasons the Lord would probably brought me to Frinton, and I agreed to do it.
So there was a matter of funding the purchase of that suitable piece of land, A church extension fund was opened, a treasurer and secretary were appointed, and applications were made for financial assistance to Essex Baptist Association, the Baptist Union Corporation Limited, the Baptist Building Fund, and other denominational funds. So how difficult was it raising the funds even to get started? Are you able to take your mind back to that?
I don't remember us ever having a difficulty with the funding. What was very impressive was the fact that when the need was stated, the funds were provided. There were a number of folk in the church membership who clearly had been in business and were in very fortunate positions with regard to the size of their pensions, but the giving was very generous. And right from the start, right from the word go, Mr. Wright made it perfectly plain to the church that this involved everybody, every single person. And as such, I don't remember that funding ever proved to be an embarrassment or a difficulty. At just the right time, those funds were available.
So it wasn't going to be easy. You noted in your book that, and I'm quoting, the adversary of souls was not prepared to give an inch, let alone 3/4 of an acre, to the kingdom of God without a fight. Can you tell us something of that? I think you compared Frinton Free Church to David, whilst the developers you compared to Goliath. That was Greater London Council, no less.
Yes, well, it was a shock to us all when it was discovered that the actual documents confirming the purchase of the site indicated that the Greater London Council had in fact encroached onto the site, and therefore we hadn't got what we'd agreed to buy. And that proved to be a basis for debate and argument and consideration for about 4.5 years, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The Greater London Council were, of course, in a vast expansion in towns all over the country. And I think that they probably didn't realise that Little Frinton was going to stand in the way of their plans. They were not very helpful to start with, but gradually, as we continued to pray and to seek the Lord's guidance, it became clear that they were in fact replicating in some ways the story from the Old Testament of David and Goliath. We were very much David, the little boy, terrified was Frinton Free Church. However, they hadn't the story, of course, hadn't been completed, and Goliath, even though he was a formidable foe in the form of the GLC as it was then, hadn't bargained for the Lord's hand in it all. And the outcome, of course, we are rejoicing in today.
Well, we talk some little more about that in a moment, because I understand that lengthy and complicated legal negotiations took place. The outcome was that the church site be moved further down Garden Road, retaining the same area of land, but in a somewhat different shape to the original proposal. However, there was another hurdle to overcome. A main sewer pipe ran through the site, limiting the area available for building. Did that take long to resolve that?
Yes, it did, because it involved lawyers, and I don't say that in any sense critically. That's just the nature of the law. But it did take a long while to resolve, and it was a disappointment and a setback, we as church members felt, but in fact it was not that at all. Again, the Lord was preparing another piece of the jigsaw, and quite out of all of that came a wonderful answer to help the work forward, which we hadn't anticipated, i.e., the offer of compensation ultimately. And I think to get to that stage, as far as I can recall, was about 4 years plus.
And I think that was the stage that the Lord nudged you in a slightly different direction. You were prompted to consider that the traditional style of church building was not the real answer, but a multi-purpose building which could be used to meet special needs on weekdays and to provide a sanctuary for public worship on the Lord's Day. Now, how was this progressed, and was the arrival of the Reverend Donald Bridge to the pastorate in 1972 a turning point?
Yes, it was, insofar as we were looking in a fresh direction for the development of the site. Mr. Wright had had a wonderfully blessed ministry of 19 years in Frinton, and certainly a lot of the elderly folk were heartbroken to think that he was leaving. But he was answering a call to a new type of ministry in the north of England, and it meant, therefore, that when he announced his departure, we had to think in terms of replacing the minister. And we went through the usual procedures, which were that names were submitted, and we went through the first list, and we didn't, from the list and from the details given, feel happy about inviting any one of them to come and see us and talk to us about it. And so some months later, another list was provided. And on this list was the name of Donald Bridge. And the interesting detail they gave about Donald was that he had been instrumental in planting a new church on the outskirts of Sunderland. And so we felt that maybe the Lord is saying to us, this man is the person who could easily lead you in the direction that you need to go. So it was decided that we would invite Mr. Bridge to come and preach, with a view, obviously, to the possibility of becoming minister of the church. Now, here's a little quirk that, again, is an indication of God's hand in it all. It was agreed by the diaconate that the church secretary and one other deacon should go to Sunderland to hear Mr. Bridge preach in his own church. Well, Sunderland isn't just round the corner. We decided between us when we would go. And I took the precaution of getting in touch with the area superintendent of the Northern Baptist Association to make certain that Mr. Bridge would be preaching on a particular Sunday.
Absolutely.
And the message came back from the area superintendent, he will be preaching at both services on that day. Fine. So it was decided that the deacon and myself would drive up to Sunderland on the Saturday afternoon / evening. We would go to the service on the Sunday morning, and then we would drive back to Frinton later in the day. That night, something very unusual and rare for me happened. I was violently sick. I hadn't experienced anything like it for ages. And so it was perfectly obvious to me that we couldn't drive up to Sunderland on the Saturday. So we rethought our plans and we said, right, well, the area superintendent confirms he's preaching in the evening as well as the morning. So we'll drive up on Sunday morning, have the evening service, and then drive back on Monday morning. So we did that. We drove up and we had the service, and we were very impressed. And we were even more impressed when we noticed on the notice sheet that we'd been given as we went into the church in Sunderland that in fact Mr. Bridge was not preaching in that church on Sunday morning. He was preaching at the new daughter church that he'd established outside of Sunderland. So had we have gone up on the Saturday, it would have been a wasted journey. But the Lord's hand was on it all. And therefore, when we came back and related this story, everybody began to feel that the Lord's hand is in this. And we came back and reported, and on the basis of that, the deacons asked me to write to Mr. Bridge and invite him to come down, which he did, and immediately we fell in love with him, and we particularly liked his ministry, which was so Bible-based, it was most encouraging. The one problem that we just had and in our minds was, can we deal with that northern accent? And some of the old folk in the church, you remember, would find that difficult, and they expressed that view that we thought he was good, but we couldn't understand a lot of it, what he was saying. That was the comment, you see. Anyway, we invited him for a second time, and the view was clearly that, yes, this was the man that we wanted. And so the invitation went, and Don Bridge came to Frinton, and he started his ministry. But he came armed with the experience of having planted a daughter church on the boundaries of Sunderland. And it was him who, through the possibility of this development of a site for the wider community and its needs, and the possibility of that being done in conjunction with the Baptist Men's Movement Housing Association, that it would be possible to do such a project and for it to prosper. And that's what ultimately happened.
Mm-hmm. So who were the BMMHA? Can you tell us
Men's Movement Housing Association.
Yeah, and what was their involvement?
Well, their involvement was that Don, when he came, was aware of the fact that they had purchased land from some churches up and down the country in order to build accommodation, mainly for elderly folk, flats and so on. And it was thought that maybe, in view of the size of the plot here in Frinton, it would be possible for them to build some accommodation for elderly folk in the district, in which case they would pay a sum to the church, which would make that possible. And obviously that would go a long way towards financing our project. And that is precisely what happened.
So all the delays must have been very frustrating. And I believe that quite dramatically, the Lord gave you a confirming sign. And you mentioned it earlier, the compensation for encroachment upon the original site. And that was at that particular time when that compensation was most needed.
Yes, indeed. And it was at a time when some of the folk were having doubts as to whether we could really afford to go ahead. And then this news that we could sell this plot for a few £1,000s, which could go towards the development of the site and the church, that this was what came as such a blessing and a boost.
So on the 13th of February 1974, at a special church meeting, a resolution was passed, quite a long resolution, so I don't think, perhaps I will, as it's so important because it's the foundation of Homelands Church. This special church meeting adopts the scheme for the Homelands Christian Centre. This special church meeting approves the detailed scheme for the erection of the church and community hall at an estimated cost of £42,000 and the granting of a 99-year lease for £20,000 to the BMMHA Limited on that portion of the Homelands site required for the erection of the Old People's Flats. This special meeting gives the elders and deacons authority to negotiate such loans as may be required to a maximum of £10,000 from any or all of the Baptist Building Fund, the Baptist Union Loan Fund, the Essex Baptist Association, all on the most favourable terms obtainable. Planning approval was finally granted in 1974. Additional funds were raised, tenders received, and a contractor appointed, and in February 1975, construction work began with the flats and the multi-purpose hall scheduled for completion by Easter 1976. At this point, it became a matter of prime importance to maintain and encourage the continuing interest and practical support of all members. And I believe this is when Paul became involved. Can you tell us who Paul is and what this was about?
Well, Paul, of course, is my son, and he had always had a hobby of craft work, and he had built from old scraps of material that he found or were given to him, and he'd create something unique and lovely from it. And clearly, some folk in the church were aware of that hobby of Paul's, and we felt that it would be helpful if there was perhaps a model of what was proposed in the entry vestibule of the church, because that could help to generate further funds, bearing in mind that the congregations swelled considerably during the summer months, and therefore they could help us if they caught the vision of this new building project. And so that's what happened. And Paul produced this, and the result was that apparently it was so good, done to scale according to the architect's plans. And I do recall it standing in the vestibule at the Free Church for many months leading up to the completion of the project. And it did just that. It helped people to remember, both practically and most importantly in prayer support, for the whole project. And that was approved of by the architect, because he cancelled his plans to have one of his own staff make a model of the project.
it was envisaged that the formative nucleus of the new church would be drawn from the membership of Frinton Free Church, and in July 1975 it appointed the Reverend Arthur Francis as Honorary Associate Minister at Homelands. When you realised that the contractors were on target for a spring 1976 finish, your thoughts turned to furnishings and equipment, and you likened it to the Old Testament description of the building of the temple. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, we invited people either to make monetary donations or specific gifts of items for the furnishing of the church. And in that way, we went a long way to providing the necessary items and furnishings that were necessary. And it was something that caught the imagination of people, and something which helped men and women within the membership to recognize that they're all part of it, and in so many different ways they're able to help, even by the donation of such things as the Bible or the chairs, etc.
So the opening service was planned for Palm Sunday 1976. Homelands Christian Centre was handed over to the church on the 8th of March 1976. Can you remember that first Sunday evening service? You described it as a hectic but thrilling experience.
Well, obviously, the minister, Don Bridge, was conducting the first service in the new church. And so it fell to me as church secretary to conduct the church in the Free Church in Connaught Avenue. And clearly a vast amount of interest, so the congregation in Connaught Avenue was not as big as it would normally have been. But because of that, the situation at Homelands was quite dramatic. The building was designed to accommodate 100 people seated, and we'd got 100 chairs. But in fact, it was clear by about 6:15 that the congregation was going to far exceed the 100 seats. So folk from the Free Church started using the car to take a consignment of chairs from the Free Church up to Homelands for people to sit. And I gather that obviously some of the congregation would have sat outside and shared in it in that way. But that was the remembrance that I have of it. Apart from one other thing, I was conducting, as I said, the service in Connaught Avenue, and of course, in between the prayers or the Bible reading, there'd be another thump, another bang, and that was another consignment of chairs going up. And so that was the way that it worked, and it was quite thrilling and exciting.
That must have been an amazing evening.
Yeah.
I'm sorry you weren't part of it, although you made your own contribution by distributing the chairs.
Yes, that's right. Amazing.
It's a truly remarkable story, and thank you for dedicating your time this afternoon. Just one final question, if I may. What has it been like to see Homelands Church grow and develop over the years?
Well, it's been very exciting when you enter into a venture like that. Because we're human, there's always the what ifs and sometimes the doubts about whether it might succeed. And undoubtedly, they had those sort of problems. But each step of the way, the Lord clearly led. Not least, ultimately, in the longest ministry of the Reverend Graham Dallison, because he was one of the youth leaders in Frinton Free Church, and he felt called to the ministry, and the church in Connaught Avenue decided that they would pay his fees for training at Spurgeon's College, which we did, without any recognition of the fact that ultimately the dividend would come, because Graham would come back as minister of the Homelands Free Church and have a very successful and thrilling ministry there over many years, from which he's just retired, of course, recently.
Yeah.
And that was one of the unexpected outcomes, but that was nice.
It was wonderful. On behalf of the members of Homelands Church, thank you for giving us your time this afternoon, telling us of your experiences, and we look forward to the membership being able to listen to your story.
Well, I hope it makes some sense, but the recall after 50 years is not as clear as it might have been. I'm having to rely on what I had written all those years ago, but it has been exciting, and it's a real thrill to see how it is progressing now and the way that it is developing. And I know that it was a great blessing in so many ways to so many different people, not least my own sister, who only less than 2 years ago went to be with the Lord at 103. And she found lovely fellowship and friendship in the ministry of the church there. And so it has been a real blessing and a real joy to be involved and to see how the work is prospering. And we have to say, this is the Lord's doing. And it is marvellous in our eyes.
Absolutely wonderful. I couldn't help but think that on that Palm Sunday, when you had that first evening service, there would have been a sign outside saying, "Standing room only." And that's my dream for Homelands Church, that one day we'll have to put up a sign to say, "Standing room only." Thank you, Derrick. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, and I hope it'll be some help to you.